We've got a couple different things we're going to try to go through tonight. One being just talking generally about what the rules are for building small homes in your backyard in Maine. Process to figure out how you would go about building and how to decide what to do, and then how to kind of get started. And I guess to back up to introduce myself and Alexis. So my name is Chris Lee, and I'm head of design and development at a company called Backyard ADUs that me and a few colleagues started about 1.5 years ago in order to help people build small homes in their backyards and make new construction available to more people. So new construction doesn't just have to mean big new McMansions, which not a lot of people we're finding want anymore. And Alexis is joining us as our head of marketing, and she's going to be fielding questions and kind of moderating, making sure that throughout the evening this is useful for everybody. So thank you, Alexis. And Alexis, do you want to just say how people can get questions in, and how we'll be fielding questions throughout the night?
Yes. So the best way to get questions in and make sure they get answered is to throw them in the Q&A. If you can't figure out how to do that, the chat's fine, but the Q&A is the easiest for us and the best way to get your questions answered. And just throw them in there whenever you get a chance, and I will be your voice and ask Chris and vocalize them so everybody knows what questions being asked, etc.
Right. Excellent. Okay, so we don't have a huge group tonight, so we weren't necessarily going to focus on specific towns, but because we have a smaller group, there is a chance that we might be able to try to field questions about specific towns that people have called in from, and with a number of towns, and we'll take an opportunity too to look at a few specific bylaws to kind of give people an idea of how you would go in and get some of this information. If everyone could do us a favor and put in the chat what town you're calling in from, that would be very helpful. That way we can see if there's a lot of people calling in from South Portland, or if there's a lot of people calling in from Brunswick. Thanks, Larissa, or anywhere. We can try to tailor what we're talking about. All right, so we've got Portland, we've got Harpswell, Brunswick. Brunswick's a good one. We've got my wife and I live in Brunswick, and we've got a model home in our office in Brunswick. That's where I'm calling in from right now, and Alexis is calling in from South Portland. Okay, so what I'm going to do. Okay, so we've got a few more. We've got Farmington and Minot. Bernice, unfortunately, I have not looked at Farmington or Minot yet. Open Cape Cod down in Bourne, Mass. Okay. And then Bridgeton in the Brownfield area. Patrick, we're actually working on a small home up on Highland Ave in Bridgeton right now. We broke ground earlier this week. A house that we actually built as a accessory dwelling unit in Scarborough, a little cute little cape. Anyway, so let me share my screen, and we'll start with a couple of slides. As I'm saying that, I'm also just going to stream to Facebook as well. Just give me one moment, everybody. Share on a page. Okay. All right, so let's share my screen. All right, and Brimfield, I assume that's Brimfield, Mass as well. All right. I know that Southern Maine is sometimes referred to as Southern Massachusetts, but I've never heard of it reversed. But anyway, so to the folks on from Mass, we probably won't get into the Mass rules specifically. However, the rules in Southern Maine this is going to be applicable to Massachusetts, especially on the Cape Cod and Bourne. I think they all have rules that are pretty advantageous for this and kind of follow the general rules. Unfortunately, Ed, Brimfield does not allow these. I think the last time we checked, they've got more stringent, old-fashioned style ADU rules. Okay, so sharing. Let's share desktop. Okay. All right. So as I'm going through this, please feel free to jump in with any questions that you have. Alexis, I can't see your questions, but Alexis is keeping an eye on it, and she'll stop me. These are much more enjoyable if we're going back and forth and making it more of a conversation like it would be if we were in person. So please jump in. All right, so oversized backyard tiny home. So we're going to talk about quickly, just define what are we talking about. What's the difference between what we're talking about and what a lot of people think of as a tiny home. We're going to talk generally about the rules for Southern Maine, and to the people that are calling in from Broomfield and the Cape. What we're going to share is going to apply to how you can go and look at your zoning bylaw as well. And then third, we're going to kind of show you how to find some of this stuff. I'm going to go and bring up a couple of zoning bylaws and show you how to read them, because they tend to be long documents. So here's an example of a backyard home. This is a 575 square foot home. And it's in the backyard. It's not attached to the house. It's still an in-law suite. It's an accessory dwelling unit, a detached accessory apartment. And this takes up roughly a 30-foot square. And it's one of the designs we've seen and done that it works great for in-town lots or in the back corner of a yard, kind of off to the trees, with a patio looking up at the main house. So if you've got family living in it, it feels like it's close, but you're not right on top of each other, and you've got shared living spaces. So it's not, and the other thing to note is it doesn't necessarily have to be tiny. It can be a reasonably sized structure, providing a decent amount of living space for somebody to live in. And the difference between these and I kind of just touched on this, but this and your typical in-law apartment, these detached accessory dwelling units are close, but they're not too close. As we've been talking to people and helping people build these in their backyards for their parents or as rentals or whomever it might be, not a lot of people actually want to share a wall, even sharing like a breezeway. They want to be neighbors. They want to be close, but they don't want to be too close. And by detaching the structure and putting it in a backyard or a side yard, it achieves that. They're typically going to have a separate electric meter, so you can track electric on its own, but almost always going to have shared water and sewer. And that applies to both city water or city sewer. And then the biggest difference between these and tiny homes on wheels is they're going to meet all local building codes. So for all intents and purposes, they're just a small house and go through the building code process. So what are these called? So this is pretty important, and probably one of the most important things when you're trying to get information about these from your local planning department or building department. Which one you approach depends on how big the town is. But these are called primarily in Southern Maine, and for the people in Mass, they're called accessory dwelling units, or they're called detached accessory apartments. And between these two it's pretty evenly split. It's pretty evenly split. Some towns are calling these accessory apartments, which is an older term for them. It's a more traditional term for it. And some of the towns that have updated their bylaws recently have updated the term to accessory dwelling unit, which is a term that kind of kicked off in California and Oregon, which has been leading the way forward on these small homes. And then some towns just come up with some different name for it. We're going through the motions on an approval right now in North Berwick, and they just decided to call them supplemental apartments to confuse things. And as an example, if you're not using the terminology that the town likes to use, they just pretend not to know what you're talking about. So when we went to North Berwick and we incorrectly included accessory dwelling unit on our application, they said that these were not allowed in North Berwick when they're just called supplemental apartments. So get the words right when you're talking to your code enforcement officer or whoever is in planning. And then here's another neat example of a potential backyard home and a neat story and a half house, which provide a little bit more living on a smaller footprint, which can be important if you don't have a whole lot of space. So I don't know if anyone on the call, is anyone on the call specifically interested in movable tiny homes? Or is everyone just looking to build a permanent structure for a family to live in or as a rental? You can answer if you do one way or the other, we can talk to both, but the difference between these two, obviously they look pretty similar. They're both small. They're both probably able to go down the road. The difference is the one on the right is on a foundation. It's connected to water and sewer, and it's a permanent structure. It meets all building code. Whereas the one on the left, it may have been built to building code, but it's not. We don't know that, and it's not hooked up to. It wouldn't be hooked up to water and sewer like this, at least permanently in a code compliant way. You can hook obviously an RV or a tiny home up to water and sewer temporarily. But you need to take extra steps to make sure that stuff doesn't freeze.
Chris, we have all answers are permanent, and everyone says they want a permanent building. And then someone said that some interest, they've got a client with a THOW, THOW.
Oh, tiny house on wheels.
Ah.
So it depends. So I guess the tiny house on wheels question. Tiny Homes of Maine has more information specifically on where tiny house on wheels are allowed, but a lot of time, and Maine did just pass a state level ordinance that basically classifies them as RVs and recreational vehicles. I think Tiny Homes of Maine said that Chelsea is one town in Maine that does allow them. But for specific info on where your client would be able to put that or rent that, I would check out Tiny Homes of Maine website. The other key is when that structure was built, it needs to have been built in a documented way to show that it was built to building code, whether residential or recreational vehicle. So other exciting stuff in Maine. So Maine has 3 different bills right now. I don't know if these are in the legislature or the Senate, but there's 3 different things looking at housing and ADUs in particular. So we've got, and I think this one may have already, or maybe in the process of going through, but they set up a commission to just start researching ways that zoning and land use is slowing down housing development. And hopefully that will lead to some neat ideas. They're forming an advisory commission of all kinds of different stakeholders in the state to try to provide expertise and hopefully come up with some neat ideas. Other one, which apparently it's obvious that accessory dwelling units are a great way to help make housing more affordable. And it primarily does this just by helping families consolidate households, merging incomes. So you've got multiple incomes, multiple generations paying for the same piece of land. Um, and in some cases to generate rental income for an owner or create just an affordable ownership opportunity. So that's coming up. Hopefully that gets approved. New Hampshire did that a while back where they made all towns, they required all towns to allow accessory apartments or ADUs in some form. Connecticut's talking about it right now. Massachusetts hasn't got there yet, but Maine will hopefully join the ranks. And then the third one here, they're talking about allowing people to live in tiny homes as the primary or accessory dwelling unit. And interestingly, just this past week, Portland, Oregon, just legalized people to live in RVs and tiny homes on wheels all over Portland, Oregon just did that all over the state. So people in Portland, Oregon can now live in RVs and driveways. Kind of interesting. I don't know where I stand on that, but it's interesting. So we'll see where Maine lands on it. If we'll have more people living in RVs and driveways and backyards, but it definitely could make a dent, obviously, because those are a lot less expensive than building a brand new structure. And there's a lot of them out there that aren't used. So this is going to be a LD 153. It's going to be a super interesting thing to follow in the next several months. So who's living in these? So the number one reason people are building these for multi-generational living. The majority of people we've helped build these, they've been building it for an aging parent or a child. And we have not helped someone do one as a rental yet. So it's primarily bringing families closer together, helping taking care of an aging parent, and overall reducing the cost of living for the family unit. This is kind of the holy grail that people have hoped that ADUs would allow, but just helping an elderly person downsize out of their bigger home into an ADU and sells or rents the main house. Kind of knocks two birds with one stone. It creates that affordable unit for the elderly person who is experiencing an acute housing crunch because there's just a lack of smaller units and smaller accessible units out there, and then puts a bigger house on the market for a family, which is also a high need. And then another group of people that we've seen as a huge need for these is people with disabilities. There's very few housing options for them. They're pretty much stuck with really poor Section 8 housing or nothing. And there's a point in time when this becomes a huge issue for families, and it's when a child with a disability is becoming an adult and is able to live independently, but still needs to live close. So people with Down syndrome or severe autism, they can live independently, but they still need to be close to close to a caregiver. And doing this is building an ADU in the backyard is a wonderful way for these families to continue living together. And hopefully this will be relevant for Maine. We're going to try to get something like this in Maine approved, but in Massachusetts has a program that gives homeowners $50,000 to build an accessory dwelling unit for someone with a disability or for someone who's aging in place and is starting to suffer some of the ails of aging, like mobility challenges or needs additional help. And it's a 0% deferred payment loan. But we would love to see Maine do something like that. And we're going to be talking to hopefully Ryan Fecto at the state level and various people to get something like that through, because it's helped several people in Mass so far build these. All right. Now for a really dense table. So here's a list of towns that we've taken a look at in Maine to see if these are allowed or not. We can send this out so you can scan it. This is a work in progress. Our next step to this table is to do write-ups. I don't know if anyone has looked at our website, but we have write-ups for Brunswick, North Yarmouth, Portland, South Portland, Scarborough, and a few others. And we're going to do that for all of these. But I'll read through these. So column 1 says whether or not these detached accessory dwelling units are allowed. So the backyard small homes. So Kittery allows them. Elliott, it's not clear, but we think that they might. South Berwick definitely does not. North Berwick might be. I said earlier, we're actually going through the process in North Berwick with a homeowner right now, and we're going to try to get one approved. York does allow them. Gunquit, no. Wells, no. Kennybunk, it's unclear. Kennebunkport does. Arundel does. But Biddeford does. Saco does. Old Orchard Beach doesn't. Old Orchard Beach has a really strict family-only accessory dwelling unit rule. Scarborough allows them. South Portland doesn't, but South Portland is in the process of updating their zoning bylaw because their neighbor that they compete with, Portland, just did. So they're trying to keep up. They're kind of sandwiched between Scarborough and Portland, so they're going to have to get on the bandwagon. Portland does. They have an amazing bylaw for these now. Gorham does not. They've got a fairly strict bylaw. Westbrook doesn't. Buxton doesn't. Wyndham does. Falmouth does. Falmouth has one of the better zoning bylaws that we've seen so far. Yarmouth does, but it's a family-only bylaw. North Yarmouth does, and that's a great town for these. Freeport does. Brunswick does. Gray does not. And sorry, we didn't do Harpswell yet. We started looking at Harpswell, and we actually might use that one. Actually, we'll use Harpswell as an example to see if we can figure out if they do by digging into their zoning bylaw in a moment. So actually, why don't we start with that? Why don't we take a break from the slideshow and see if we can figure out if Harpswell allows these. So that's not what we want. Okay, so let's jump to. All right, so in this case, Google is going to be your friend. So what you're looking for when you're trying to figure this out, just to start, is your land use ordinance, zoning ordinance, zoning bylaws. So very simply, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in Harpswell zoning bylaw, and usually you're going to get one of these two things. So Harpswell, first hit, we don't want this shoreland zoning, although that might apply if you're within 200 feet of the ocean, which a lot of places in Harpswell is, or the ocean or a stream or any body of water. Well, we're going to jump in here and let's see what we can find. So a lot of ordinances. So in this case, this is what I think we're looking for, the basic land use ordinance. So if we click on this, we can open this up. Oh, let me reopen that.
Chris, while that's loading, we have a question about Cape Elizabeth. Do you know if they allow ADUs?
I don't yet. I think we missed that one when we were doing our list, but we'll have to check Cape Elizabeth. So let's see. So when you open up one of these PDFs, I think that the first thing that we typically do to quickly find out if these are even in here is just do a find. And remember what the terms were that we said these might be called. So they're going to be called an accessory apartment. So you can start with that, not found. Let's try accessory dwelling. This is going to come back unconclusive on the first one that we tried to do. That's not good. Okay. So secondary here, we're going to take a quick look. Let's jump to the land use requirements. All right, see, this is the problem with doing something live without staging your review. So this in Harpswell, these may be called something, there it is, look at that, accessory residential units, we found it. So let's jump to that and see what they have to say. So I guess I was getting a little nervous there that we weren't going to be able to find it, but this is an example of a town that that came up with their own term for accessory dwelling unit. They call them accessory residential unit. But what you're first going to find when you're looking this up is some kind of description of what's allowed. And in this case, it says it may be added to a dwelling unit. It must be owner occupied. That's very common. The only town in Maine that does not require owner occupancy is Portland. And you have to be the principal resident. So if you've got to be there at least 6 months of the year, which is probably important in Harpswell. You don't want people coming and just being there for a bit and using it as rental. And then the second thing we're looking for in here is if it specifies anything about the form. Which it doesn't do clearly, which is also not uncommon. So interesting. So this one in Harpswell is going to be an example of one where we'd have to do a little bit of digging onto whether or not you'd be able to do a detached variety. This being here means that you can very certainly do something attached, and it would take a little bit more research and probably a conversation with the CEO who would be approving this to see if they would lean towards approving a detached ADU. So that's one way, if anyone took notes on how to do that, finding your zoning bylaw and quickly jumping to the section. So let me go back into the PowerPoint or the keynote, whatever we're calling this. All right, so what are the zoning rules? So we just showed you how to find it. So, and we talked to this one briefly. So owner occupancy, the difference between an ADU and a second unit, just like a two-family home, is that typically, and again, Portland's the only case where this doesn't apply, one of the two units must be owner occupied. So the person who owns the property must live in the ADU or in the main house, meaning you can't rent both of them out. And again, Portland is the only town that eliminated that specific rule.
Chris, we have a question about owner occupancy.
Sure.
What happens with zoning owner occupancy requirements after the unit is built and the owner moves or dies or whatever?
So towns typically specify precisely what to do in that situation. So I'll first touch on Portland because it's unique. So in Portland, after the ADU is built by the owner of the property or the owner doesn't have to live there anymore. They could rent both units out. It could be sold. It could be it doesn't matter. In other towns where there is an owner occupancy requirement, always, a few different things can happen. When the property is sold, some towns are going to require the special permit which was issued, or the permit that was issued, to be renewed by the new owner. And towns that do this are few and in between. and it's typically going to be towns that have family only rules that have old school rules. So examples are going to be North Berwick, Old Orchard Beach. I think Yarmouth is going to fit in that category. But anywhere, South Berwick's going to be one. They've got a terrible bylaw. But yeah, any towns that have restrictive rules generally require the new owner to renew them. But for the most part in Maine, it's not going to be an issue. It's just going to transfer to the new owner. All right, so size. Every single town has some restriction on the size of the units. Sometimes there's a minimum size. Well, always there is a minimum size. There is a minimum dwelling unit size per state, per building code. Maine has one, Mass has one, and sometimes a zoning bylaw will set a higher minimum than that. We've seen some towns have 300 square foot as the minimum, some have 400 square foot as a minimum. So that's sometimes there. Sometimes there's a max size that's proportional to the existing living area. And then sometimes there's just the max size. So on the right here, Brunswick is a pretty common way to restrict the size of these. So an accessory apartment shall not be greater than 750 square feet or 35% of the floor area of the principal structure, whichever is greater. That is very common in accessory dwelling unit rules, to set a max, but then also make it the max proportional to the principal structure, because they generally want these to be subordinate to the main house. But in other cases, Falmouth being one, there's just the max size. It doesn't matter how big or small the existing home is. So the other part of figuring out the size, because most of these have to be proportional to the main house, and the person from Brunswick on the call, this applies. What parts of your house count in the size that you're comparing to the ADU? So generally speaking, it's going to be gross floor area, so not appraisal floor area. Appraisal floor area pulls out ceiling heights that are less than 7-ish feet. Doesn't include basements, but towns are generally just looking at the gross floor area. But in the accessory apartment section of the bylaw, sometimes towns are going to specifically specify what to include. And Freeport's an example of this. Freeport says, shall not be larger than 40% of the finished and heated portion of the single family home. So this is kind of a poison pill to anyone that's going to try to include a 3-season room in the square feet of their house. Freeport has specifically said what's included and what's not. And then in other cases, you can include the basement. You can include the basement, you can include an attic when you're calculating this out. And to get a base point, I mean, a lot of people know how big their house is, but if you don't, that's another thing you can show. I can show real quick too. You can see the size of your house by going again to Google, type in your town name. I'm going to type one in that I know has a thing, Portland, Maine. Actually, let's do Brunswick. So in Brunswick, I'm not going to go directly there. Brunswick, property lookup. So Brunswick property lookup. Okay. So there's 2 things you can do. You can look for these Access GIS, or it's going to be one of these first 3 hits, but the town's going to have a property record that you can pull up. And in the case of Brunswick, they've got this awesome mapping tool, and we can specifically jump to a property and see what the information is that the town has. Oh, they don't have our business address yet in the Brunswick. Yeah, so we're not in there yet. So we're just going to take a random house. Let's jump to 246 Coombs Road. So in here, you can, it gives you a property card. And on this property card, it has your, the square feet of your house. And you can use that as a starting point to figure out how many square feet that you have to work with when determining the size that the ADU is going to be proportional to. So again, you go to Google and just type in the name of your town. Property lookup or property card sometimes works, and you're going to get a way to search for that. Portland is a pretty clear one. Property search, that's what will come up often, and you'll be able to pull up your property card and take a peek. Okay. Okay, so the form of an ADU. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, traditionally, these are just built above garages or spaces converted. Those are generally in bylaws referred to as an ADU within the existing home. They can also be attached. You can often attach a completely separate structure with a breezeway and meet the requirements of having an attached ADU when a town doesn't allow a detached variety. And you can typically convert garages too, which or other accessory structures, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Can you convert a non-conforming garage that's sitting right on your neighbor's property line? I'll leave a cliffhanger on whether you can do that. Couple of notes on the form. So we've noticed a couple things that can come up in towns. So you got to be aware of calling it the existing accessory structure trap. This is really just a poorly written bylaw where a town basically says that you can only build a detached accessory dwelling unit in an existing or pre-existing accessory structure, but they forget to define what makes a structure pre-existing, and don't realize that a structure is pre-existing once you've erected it and it's been there for a couple of seconds. So this is generally something that becomes an irrelevant point when you're trying to get a building permit, and one of the things that we're up against in North Berwick, and we think we're probably going to be able to beat it. And then the other thing that's important, and this applies to towns with older bylaws and that don't really want these, but unwritten rules about the terms within or attached. Sometimes when you see the word within, it means you can just build an addition and expand the size of the main house. Sometimes it means that you have to have shared living space and that the interior entrance needs to be from the existing living space. And often these rules are unwritten, and there's something that the CEO knows and decides to tell people when they're going through the process, and can generally be challenged. So as I mentioned earlier, you can convert non-conforming structures. So I got a picture here of this was an artist studio, but it's right up against the property line. Converting, whether you can do this, is a little bit complicated in different towns because you have to check a bunch of different sections. Towns are going to have a section of the zoning bylaw that have to do with non-conforming uses and structures, and they'll be very specific about what you can do with these structures, what uses you can change them between, can you expand them, can you not? Often you can expand them, but you can't increase the non-conformance. So if you're right up against the property line, you can't make it bigger along the property line, but you could expand it out towards your property, or potentially you could go up. That's how it works in Portland. And sometimes the ADU section of a bylaw is going to specifically tell you what you can do with non-conforming structures. Sometimes it will blatantly say that you can convert them at will. And often doing this is going to require a special permit from the planning board or the zoning board. So parking, pretty much all zoning bylaws have some requirements for parking. Often ADUs, well, so I wouldn't say often, ADUs may or may not be required to add parking. Use Portland as an example again, doesn't require extra parking. I believe Scarborough does require extra parking, but it will, if the section of the bylaw doesn't say anything about parking, it can be assumed that the parking needs to be that you have to comply with the parking rules and look at this as potentially an extra unit. But often this isn't an issue for a single family home with a big driveway. You can just show you've got an extra parking spot on grass or gravel or something like that, rather than having to add pavement.
Chris, we have a question.
Okay.
In Portland, can an ADU be added to an existing two-family home?
Yes, it definitely can. In Portland, you can add an ADU to any residential building. So single family, two family, three family, four family, five family. Yeah, you can add an ADU. You can even add two ADUs in Portland. Portland's got some pretty neat rules for these. So setbacks, this is anyone with a smaller lot, or when you're getting to the point where you need to figure out where you want to put it. So setbacks are different depending where you live in town, what zoning district you're in. So the first step is to figure out what zone you are in. And I'm going to take this to, what zoning, and what I've got here is a screenshot from the Portland GIS, showing you how you have to find it. And I've got red arrows there pointing at the little text that says R3 and ROS. But that's what you're looking for. Those types of zoning districts are typically like R3, D3, RB3, RR. They're usually numbered in a letter. And after you find that district, you've got to figure out what the setbacks are in that district. And you're looking for things like the dimensional requirements table, space standards, area intensity standards. And I'm going to show you quickly how to do that with Brunswick. So we'll start here again in Brunswick. We're in the GIS because we were already in there. And this is pretty common. Every town might have a different version of this, but these are called GISs. Golf India Sierra, GIS. And they allow you to get information about the town and the property. Not all towns have them, but if they do, it makes figuring this out easy. And in here, after you've found your property, you're going to go over to, they usually call them layers, and you're going to click the zoning layer. You're going to open that up, and it's going to show you zoning districts, the different colors. So one of the things about Brunswick, they have way too many zoning districts, and they used to have even more than they have now. They actually consolidated zoning districts. So I think it was last year, the year before. But anyway, you're looking at the colors and you're comparing colors, trying to figure out which one you're in. In this area, and I'm going to make this a little bit easier just so we're going to get rid of all these overlay zones. That is out of scope for the conversation today. But I will just say what the overlay zones are: things like shoreland overlays, historic district overlays, conservation overlays. Those are things that are potentially going to complicate your permitting process. So if you hear that when you're talking to someone in planning, it means you might have to file some more paperwork. But anyway, so we're comparing this. Rural Protection 1, RP1 is the district this is in. And then we're going to jump up here. I'm going to show you again how you find a zoning bylaw. So we're going to go Brunswick, Maine, zoning ordinance. Let's go with what Google suggests. They're usually right. There it is, zoning ordinance. I've clicked it before. We're going to scroll down. We're not interested in the maps. We're just looking at the maps. And we're going to take the most recent zoning ordinance. We're going to download that. Let's go to open. And then, as I said, back on here, we're looking for things called like dimensional standards. So let's type in the word here, dimensional, and see what happens. Oh, there it is. Look at that, dimensional and density standards. So dimensional being how far can you build from a lot line, and density being it's not really applicable to ADUs, but density being like how many units can you have per lot and per acre. So I'm going to revise that. I'm going to pop it in here. We're just going to jump down here until we get to what we're looking for. Oh, and here we go. So these tables are going to be in here usually like this, and they've got all of the different zones in the table. We were looking for RP1, which is Rural Protection 1. Here it is. And in Rural Protection 1, we can kind of scan down here and we can find front setback feet, 30-foot front setback. We've got a rear setback of 30 feet, and we've got a side setback of 25 feet. So this is going to define how close a detached ADU can be to our neighbors. And the closer to an in-town lot you are, so those are rural lots. If we scroll back up here, you can just see the difference. So these are going to be more dense areas. You can see front setback, it's only 15 feet, rear is only 15 feet, so it's like half of what it is out in the rural areas. So neat stuff with setbacks. All right, so this is an important one. The role of town planning and building official. So I got a picture over there of the South Portland District Director of Planning. So what you should expect from the town, they're going to do a great job of pointing you in the right direction. They are going to tell you if you're mostly right or you're mostly right or mostly wrong. And sometimes they're going to tell you if you're just right or just wrong. And they're going to do a really good job of providing guidance on applications and town processes submittal. So they're going to do a good job on that stuff. But what you don't want to expect from them is to know the best thing to do with your property for you. And you don't really want to ask them to spend a ton of time helping you develop your plans. They generally just don't have enough time. And you're not going to get what you need. Surveyors can help you do that. Architects can help you do that. It's something that we specialize in doing, which obviously me saying this stuff puts me in the biased position of saying, don't ask the town, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying, do ask the town. Just make sure you are asking them good questions, not wasting their time and not expecting too much. because there's usually a couple of people in the building department for like thousands of residents in a town. And we actually, we've had people who've gotten, they didn't get wrong information from the town, we don't think, but they misunderstood the information that a CEO gave them or a planning person gave them, and they made land purchase decisions based on information that they got, and it was not, the outcome wasn't what they expected after they'd spent tens of thousands of dollars, 40 grand on a piece of land, and didn't get to build where they thought they were going to be able to build on it based on an informal conversation that they had with the town. So anyway, make sure you're asking the right stuff of the right people. So a few building code considerations. Lofts. Lofts, they need to be compliant for egress, which means really a full staircase if it's used as a bedroom. Sometimes towns are going to approve lofts as storage lofts with ladder access, but this is town by town. Portland in particular is not going to be really thinking that this is an okay thing. They have very stringent fire code. So lofts are hit or miss. Tiny home Appendix Q, which is a revised building code for homes less than 400 square feet, does give some leeway on egress and how you can get into a loft. But you've got to be building smaller than 400 square feet, which is a true tiny house. Plumbing, these have got to be hooked up to approved city water sewer or approved septic system. And very often town ADU rules are going to require you to have an approved septic design, something signed off by a health board before you actually can move forward with anything. And then foundation's another big one. You've got to have these on a approved engineered foundation. They can't just be parked on a gravel pad. Although they could be if you could find a engineer to sign off on the gravel pad, but they've got to be on a proper foundation. And you've got helical piers to choose from. You've got frost walls. You've got you've got frost protected shallow foundations and full basements. So they're all great ways to do it. And then these have got to meet state energy code. And then I put a note in here. Portland does have an exception for something labeled as a seasonal dwelling where it doesn't need as much insulation, which is kind of neat. All right, so we kind of already did that, but so that's kind of a general overview of how to go out there and figure out what the rules are in your town. Are there any other questions about specific questions about towns? Is there anything that we glossed over? This was a pretty high level overview of this. I mean, there's a lot more questions about design and placement that I'm sure we missed, but we're going to be doing we'll be doing follow-up sessions where we can dive into it a lot more in greater detail, especially when we're focusing on specific cities and towns. Okay.